It is a great honor to be standing in this pulpit where many great ministers and preachers have stood. So I want to thank you all for coming to church on this Thanksgiving weekend. And I'm glad my title didn't scare too many of you away. I am a master of fear and a student of faith. As a girl, I slept with my bedroom door open just a crack, about 2 inches wide. I needed the light from the hall so I wouldn't be afraid. Most of us are afraid of the dark as children. Some of us remain afraid as adults. Even as we let go of childhood fears, we accumulate other, more adult fears. Fears of failing at our jobs, at our marriages, at parenting, at making enough money. We all know the demoralizing and sometimes paralyzing effects of fear. We know that avoiding what we fear can lead us down the dark road of addictions. It's difficult to succeed, to do almost anything at all, if we're focused on what we're trying to avoid. Remember riding a bike when you were a kid? I remember how hard I tried to avoid hitting one certain maple tree. That sugar maple had huge roots, which lifted up and cracked the sidewalk. The same sidewalk on which I was trying to impress my friends with my new skill. After several runs up and down the sidewalk, I realized that the more I focused on the tree, the more chance I had of bumping right into it. The trick was to not look at the tree. If I focused my eyes down the street, I managed to glide past those monster roots over the bump without crashing into anything, or even having to put my foot down to help me balance. When I focused on the tree, I focused on my fear, and I failed. When I focused beyond my fear, I succeeded. Some of you may have heard the Al-Anon acronym for fear: false evidence appearing real. I heard a new one yesterday from a friend. She said, we can succumb to fear, we can feel everything and run, or we can heal. We can face everything and recover. You might have an example in your own life when you avoided doing something you wanted to do because of some fear. Did you fear rejection or failure? Or maybe you feared success. Whatever the fear, who among us does not want to be free of it? Of course, we don't seek freedom from those fears that keep us safe. We wisely teach our children to be cautious around deep water and great heights. And we don't seek freedom from the fear which motivates us to do good work. Jean Piaget, the Swiss developmental psychologist, said, without anxiety, man would not accomplish anything at all. But I know that I seek freedom from the fear that inhibits and silences me, which imprisons me in its shadow. And so I am a master of fear and a student of faith. Some, perhaps many in this congregation, would agree with Mark Twain, who wrote, "Faith is having to believe something you know ain't so." Those of us who were scared into believing, or shamed into silence when we asked questions about creeds, or put down when we expressed doubt about a God who seemed cruel and arbitrary, are familiar with a faith that doesn't feel real. C.S. Lewis, writer of the Chronicles of Narnia and many other wonderful books, wrote about a little boy who said the very same thing. Faith is having to believe something you know ain't so. Those of us who rely on scientific methods alone to ascertain truth might agree. But for me to explain my own journey from fear to faith, we have to dig a little deeper into the meaning of the word. And so we'll start with 2 stories about the loss of faith. C.S. Lewis lost his faith when he was 10 years old, when his mother died of cancer. He was raised in the church and taught how to pray. When his mother got sick, He prayed to God that she would be healed and not die. When she died, it was more than devastatingly sad. It was supremely disappointing. Children see the world very concretely. Lewis decided that because his prayer was not answered, there was no answerer. In his grief, he made up his mind there was no God. My Aunt Gilda lost her faith at about the same age when she ate a peanut. My Aunt Gilda, the granddaughter of a rabbi, was raised in the Jewish tradition. Yom Kippur is the highest of high holy days in the Jewish calendar, a day when observing Jews fast for 24 hours. The Yom Kippur service is tiring for children because everyone recites in unison a very long list of everything they possibly could have done wrong during the preceding year. Things like forgetting to speak kindly, forgetting to help a neighbor in need, forgetting to be thankful, and on and on. So my Aunt Gilda on Yom Kippur in the year 1940 or so, anticipating this very long service and already feeling hungry due to the fasting, sneaked a peanut out of her pocket, put it in her mouth, and ate it. She waited for God to strike her dead. And when he didn't, she decided there was no God. I doubt she wanted to die, but I always heard a hint of disappointment in her voice when she told the story. Perhaps, if God had wanted to prove his existence, he might have at least thrown a big branch down right next to her. A near miss would have at least allowed for the possibility of his existence. When I say that I'm a master of fear and a student of faith, this is not the kind of faith I'm speaking of. I'm not being called toward a belief in something I know ain't so. Not raised in a church or a synagogue or a mosque, singing kirtan, sitting zazen, or with any organized or intentional spiritual practice at all, I've been free to find faith or not find faith on my own. I've resented that freedom at times and wished I'd had more spiritual guidance and instruction as a child. Your children are very lucky. But that's a story for another day. Today, I accept and claim the gift of that freedom, the freedom to discover for myself what faith means. And it is a true gift. I am deeply grateful that no one ever told me not to question, that no one ever told me I had to believe a certain way, that no one ever suggested that it was so and I had to agree it was so just because they said so. For many years, the question of faith never came up. I was happy to accumulate knowledge for knowledge's sake, to learn languages, to play music, to learn for the joy of learning. But fear continued to interfere with my life, to block me from moving toward my highest goals and aspirations. If self-actualization is the closest thing we will ever come to knowing God, as Bishop Pearson has preached from this pulpit, then fear was preventing me from coming to know God. The tension between fear and faith cast a larger and larger shadow over my life. So I have a third story about a crisis of faith to share with you. It comes from the writings of a well-loved, now deceased Episcopal priest, John Claypool. I hope it will help us dig deeper into questions of faith. What is it? What isn't it? What does it mean to say you have it? John Claypool tells a story about a young woman raised in the Episcopal Church who came home from college to Birmingham, Alabama for the holidays. She came to see her childhood minister, and she asked him to remove her from the membership rolls of the church because, she said, I can no longer in good conscience consider myself to be a Christian. Her minister asked her why, and she began to tell him about the things she was learning in school, in her psychology, political science, and drama classes. What she was learning made her think that people just believe what they want to believe, not necessarily what is true. She said, quote, I think people dig down into their needs and into their desires, and they make up their wishes, and they project them on the screen of religious belief. Reverend Claypool agreed with her that often religion and faith seem to be more fantasy, dream, and crutch than anything else. And they talked for quite a while about how what many people call faith is simply a reflection or projection of what is inside them and doesn't correspond to anything real. When they were done talking, he asked her to do 3 things. First, he said, read Mark's Gospel, as if you were reading a profile of someone in People magazine. Ask yourself, is the person this Gospel features a person who is making up ideas of God in order to escape trouble? Or is he someone who is in touch with something outside of himself that's actually getting him into trouble? Second, he said, read about Saul's conversion experience on the road to Damascus in the book of Acts. Saul's the one, he reminded her, who not only changes his name to Paul after his experience, but who changes the whole direction of his life. Saul sets out on the road with strong convictions that Jesus is not the Messiah, but the experience he has of something breaking in radically changes his perspective, even though the truth revealed to him was the exact opposite of what he had been taught all his life. As you read, he said, ask yourself if what he discovered seems to represent wishful thinking. And third, he asked her to describe her own religious vision, the one she would create if she were dreaming it up for herself. The young woman did what Claypool suggested, and they got together and talked quite a lot about faith that summer. His point in asking her to do these 3 exercises was to prove that a faith, which is not believing in something you know ain't true, comes from finding in oneself what is true. A faith of integrity that feels real comes to us as we make sense of experiences we've had, often experiences of something beyond ourselves. The logic in his exercise points to the improbability of anyone creating such a personally and spiritually demanding faith as the Christian faith from an internal desire. He proposes instead that authentic religious conclusions are discoveries, not projections. Claypool writes, authentic religious truth comes to us exactly like every other truth comes to us. That is, something beyond ourselves breaks in, and we perceive it, and we shape our conclusions according to the evidence. Religious truth is an event, Claypool says. Unlike Saul on the road to Damascus, the realness of something ultimate broke in upon me slowly as I practiced the art and science of midwifery. As I've examined my experiences as a midwife, what astonishes me most is that the characteristics of birth and faith are one and the same. The very tangible and physical act at the foundation of biological life, birth, has the same characteristics as faith, the most intangible and non-physical reality at the foundation of religious life. I'll try to explain what I mean. The core truths of the Christian message, forgiveness, sacrifice, radical compassion, and selfless giving, are not truths one would choose or invent if one were making up an ideal faith based on our projections of how we think life ought to be. Do you agree? The same is true of birth. If asked to choose, we would most likely not create the birth process as it is. Do you agree? With pain, surrender, commitment unto death, great effort, high long-term risk at its core. In fact, giving birth, like having faith, is all risk, all courage. Having faith, like giving birth, accepts doubt as integral to the process. It's hard to believe, but nevertheless very real. It really is astonishing. The characteristics of birth are the same as the characteristics of faith. I found 31 definitions of faith in the work of Paul Tillich, 21st century Protestant theologian, and I'm going to spare you most of them, I promise. But each one applies directly and seamlessly to the truths of birth. The lack of any visible seam means that the words faith and birth become interchangeable in statements about their nature. Here's what I mean. Birth, faith, is ultimate risk and ultimate courage. Birth, faith, accepts doubt as a consequence of risk. Neither arguments for belief nor the will to believe create birth or faith. Can you take two more? Okay. Faith, birth, is definite in its direction and concrete in its content. Where there is faith, birth, there is an awareness of the holy. To those who say that faith is only reassurance, that it is a psychological trick we humans play to bring order into our lives and make sense out of suffering, I ask you to consider the faith intrinsic to birth, the act required of us to bring forth new life. Birth and faith do not as much comfort as confront. They are ultimate risk. They demand total surrender and promise total fulfillment. Less fear makes birth easier, but birth happens whether there is fear or not, just as faith happens whether there is doubt or not. The reality of birth broke through my inherited skepticism about faith. Watching women struggle to bring their babies into the light proved to me that truth is of the same cloth no matter where you find it. Add my seminary studies to my experience as a midwife, and faith itself, which reaches toward the ultimate, stands beyond the claims and demands of any tradition. Faith is an ultimate and fundamental attitude of trust, and an orientation toward the unconditional, however we may name it. In other words, one can have faith in many different things. The power of love, the nature of reality itself, a God who died on the cross and through his death redeemed mankind for all eternity, and come to the truth that is faith. C.S. Lewis called himself the most reluctant convert in all the Isle of England. It took him time, 20 years or so, to find faith, which heartens me because that means we all have time. I imagine he would agree that faith is not something to be taken on faith. It must be discovery and not invention. Birth was my way, but clearly not all of you will give birth. And for many women, birth is ordinary, too painful, overwhelming, disappointing, sometimes tragic. Certainly not always mystical. But something in your life is calling you towards an ultimate concern. Something calls to your heart to surrender and promises your heart wholeness. After being here a few months, I know many of us are here this morning to discover a faith which comes from our lived experience, a faith which breaks in upon us, a faith which commands our attention and demands our commitment. If you're honest in your asking, seeking, and knocking, then you will find your own God. A different God than the one you lost when the prayers of your childhood were not answered. A different God than the one you lost when you were not struck down for lying, cheating, or stealing, coveting, or lusting. So how do we move from being masters of fear to being students of faith? I want to know the truth, and I want to know it whatever shape it takes. Those are John Claypool's words. I offer them to you as you seek your own true, authentic faith. Use them. Meditate on them. See where they lead you. I want to know the truth, and I want to know it whatever shape it takes. I was led to the shape of women struggling on behalf of life, courageously facing death, their own death and the death of their own children for life's sake. I want to know the truth, and I want to know it whatever shape it takes. These words are strong medicine for us as we walk the road from fear toward faith. May we walk it together as we step away from fear toward our own true, authentic, discovered faith. May it be true for each and every one of us. Amen.